Perhaps the most powerful and compelling form of resistance to Islamic ideology is not coming from we non-Muslims, we who have not as yet submitted our thoughts, words, actions and dreams to Islam. It's actually coming from ex-Muslims, and I'd like to share with you some of the comments that ex-Muslims have made about Islam. Okay, the quotes. Number 1. My reason for leaving Islam is very simple. I read the Quran using a little logic. The Noah's Ark that is recorded in the Quran is one of the most bizarre stories I've ever heard. Noah had, it seems, the ability to communicate with animals to ask them to come aboard his ship, so that their species would not become extinct. Back then, the early Arabs looked around themselves, and they saw a few camels and a couple of dogs, and they thought that these were all the animals in the world. They were unaware of the fact that there are over 1 billion species in the world, and some that have not even been discovered yet. What about the animals that didn't live in Arabia? Did Noah fly on a winged horse like Muhammad to go and collect the animals from all around the world? What about the species that were unable to see without a microscope? How did Noah collect them? This was enough for me to realize that the Quran is just a book of fables. I was astonished at the fact that the Quran mentions nothing about punishment for rape. The word rape is not even mentioned once in the Quran, as if it were not worth bringing up. Apparently, Allah thought it worthwhile to insist to his Prophet the necessity for praying and paying alms over 1,000 times, but rape is not worth mentioning. What I've done for the last 6 months on the internet is debate with Muslims and try to show them the light of truth. When you debate with a Muslim, and he doesn't know what to say, he always says, God is the author of the Quran because that's what it says in the Quran. It's absurd to prove something by itself. Second quote. I'm a 30-year-old male who was born in Pakistan but moved to the West with my family when I was 5. I was forced to attend religious training with ignorant and cruel mullahs. I developed a deep-seated fear of God and of not obeying his law. I made friends of all races and religions and had to reconcile that with the fascist absolutist doctrines of Islam. So I created a mental schizophrenia. In my heart I always felt that the inequality of women was wrong, that non-Muslims were just as equal and human as Muslims, that science provided much more reasonable explanation of the world than the myths of Islam ever did. But I was too paralyzed by fear and by not wanting to upset my family, so I never said anything. Then puberty hit. When I realized I was attracted to boys and fell in love with them instead of girls, I had an extremely difficult crisis of the soul. I knew the extreme contempt that Islam had for homosexuality, and I felt that I would suffer the torments of hell for feeling the way I did. I tried committing suicide in college, but was saved by a friend, and that was the turning point. I decided that I was no longer going to be a slave to a barbaric, fascist, sexist, homophobic, totalitarian, obscurantist, cultist, joyless, loveless, fear-mongering, horrible ideology. Today, free of Islam and religion, I feel more liberated and powerful, and in control of my life than I could ever imagined. I've created a family for myself based on people who share my values and who accept and love me for who I am. I wish all Muslims around the world would have the same opportunities to unchain themselves from the lies they're brainwashed into believing. I realize I'm very privileged in the West where I have the freedom to choose my life's path. Quote number 3. I'm a woman who was born in a supposedly liberal Muslim state. However, I learned at a young age that in any Muslim country, women do not count for much. I was told that men were smarter, better and stronger than women. When I was married, my husband continued to try to reinforce male superiority over me. He continually told me that he was the boss, and I was to do what he told me to do. He reminded me that if I wanted to leave the country, I had to have written permission from him. My mother-in-law was forced to be a slave of my father-in-law. He would stay out all night at cafes, laughing with his friends and soliciting prostitutes. My mother-in-law was suffering from ill health, but she was scared to leave the house to go to see a doctor without permission from her husband. Her husband would always deny permission, so that he wouldn't have to pay the doctor the money he wanted to use on entertainment. I started to refuse to wear hijab, and my husband's beatings didn't change my mind. Then I read the Quran for the first time critically. It was a disgusting book full of hatred and intolerance. When my husband and I immigrated to the United States, I bought a copy of Ibn Warwick's Why I Am Not a Muslim. As I read the book, I felt like I was being liberated. Quote number 4. I grew up a Muslim, but I always had my doubts about the whole thing. As I grew older, I started to look at religion as a social phenomenon. Now there's no doubt in my mind that Judaism, Christianity and Islam are all man-made. However, I found the Islamic message to be particularly disturbing, mainly because it requires at its core suppression and persecution of all those who oppose it. And a final quote. I could not remain a Muslim because Islam hates women. I think I always knew this, but as I got older, that knowledge became more acute. Islam wants women to cover themselves, to stay indoors, to obey men, however stupid those men are. Islam says that women are inferior in every way. Islam distorted my father's feelings. He didn't want us, his own daughters, to be happy or fulfilled. He only wanted us to be good Muslims, and for daughters this means to be suffering Muslims. What sort of religion forces fathers to make their daughters suffer? What sort of father thinks that his daughter's hair is shameful? What sort of father tells her she cannot sing and dance when she's happy? A Muslim father. This is why I am not a Muslim. My children, boys and girls, will be able to feel the wind in their hair. They will not be ashamed. They can sing and dance as much as they like. Nothing they do will shame me, as long as it's done with life and joy. Islam has no joy. Islam is a cult of tears and death. Now many of us attack Islam with a very broad sword, hoping to cause as much damage to it as possible. But my question to you is this. When you attack Islam, are you sure you're not also attacking those who could be your greatest allies of all? The men, women and children most cruelly affected by Islamic dogma. Those who, though controlled and misled by the cynical, self-seeking, largely atheist imams and mullahs, are perhaps our greatest hope of helping to consign the Quran, Muhammad and all the hate-mongers back to where they belong, in the history books of a primitive and tribal 7th century. Make it easier for Muslims to become ex-Muslims. They know there's no hell like an old hell.